those first few months and the first year after the fire, people were paying, 10 grand a month just to get a place to live. And there was just this like chaos and trauma of living through that market, almost more traumatic than the experience of fleeing the fire itself for many people.
Take us to the moon, take us to the moon, whoa, that's a big YouTube intro. Hey everyone, HalfPint here, and I just wanted to say real quick before we start, like this video now if you haven't already, because it really helps me out, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future videos and shorts that I post. Follow me at HalfPint Streams on Twitch so you can catch us live, join us in the chat, we always have a blast. And I also make TikToks if that's where you watch short form content. I'm available there at HalfPint Streams as well. That's all, back to the video. Oh yeah, but let's check out this majority report. It's about climate change will make America unrecognizable and the migration patterns we can expect to see. I know it's kind of a bummer, but after this I got some fun content. We're going to look at trolling Trump supporters. Then we're going to look at fascists getting humiliated. Then we already watched the comedian on 9/11. We got a Survivor video. Apparently Chris Angel's got a new TV show that's really cringe. And then Cutie Cinderella's Master Baker Day 2. We're gonna check that out. So we got a lot of stuff going on. Even though it's about to get a little less fun, it's gonna get real fun soon after that. Oh my god, I muted it again. Oh god, one day.
We are back, and
One
we're
day I
joined
won't be so
now
bad
by
at streaming.
Jake Biddle, staff writer at Grist and author of The Great Displacement, Climate Change and the Next American Migration. Jake, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. So your book really does center around people's firsthand stories here in the U.S. In terms of displacement from climate change. Hundreds of thousands of people in the United States displaced from their homes every year due to the effects of climate change. Like, how did you come upon that structure? Did you go into writing your book with that intention, both making it more of like a personal focus on people's experience and also making it US based?
Yeah, so I thought that it would be useful to, what I wanted to do at the start was just to try to document what the present tense effects of climate change in the US were, because I thought that people tend to conceive of it as a problem that will either happen in the future, the distant future, or somewhere else, like sort of very, very far distance across,
which is crazy because we're already seeing the effects right now. I mean, with the Canada fires, they're literally happening right now,
and especially with the phenomenon of housing displacement or migration, I think people tend to think of it as something that is just not really like a US problem. And so what I was just trying to do is show, okay, after these climate disasters that, sort of appear and disappear from the news cycle relatively quickly, like what are the long-term effects on the communities where these disasters happen, and what ends up happening to people who get, temporarily displaced from their homes, how many of them make it back, and how many sort of end up moving somewhere else, whether voluntarily or involuntarily.
I really also liked how your title is a reference to the Great Migration, the 20th century migration of Black Americans from the South to other cities around the country. And that part obviously must have been intentional as well, right? Because your book does do a great job of focusing on the racial politics of
the disproportionate effect on people of color, especially on the southern hemisphere, of climate change,
climate displacement in this country.
Yeah, I mean, I was sort of trying to draw there's both a similarity and a distinction, right? And one is that, the similarity is that, like the Great Migration, climate migration in the United States, it cleaves people along lines of race and class very distinctly, but there's also a dissimilarity, right, where the Great Migration was a relatively sort of one-directional movement of people from a very specific region of the country to a very specific other region. There was both a push factor and also a pull factor of, wages, the promise of better treatment in northern cities. And in the case of climate displacement, it's much more chaotic, right? Like, sort of happens everywhere in different parts of every region, and there's by no means like a single destination or coordinated direction of this movement. And so in the book, I kind of liken it to like
no one really knows.
A pot is kind of like,
no one really knows where better is right now, or what will end up being safe later on. So like, I don't know. A lot of people argue that the Midwest is where people will end up going, because as water levels rise, Coastal cities will become less coastal and more water. They will be swallowed by the sea as it creeps up on our land masses. And so places like the Midwest are in the best position because they are furthest inland, less likely to be impacted by that part. They will, however, be impacted by, the fracking caused earthquakes from gathering oil, which is also part of climate change. They will be affected by the more drastic, strong storms, the dry summers that make for wildfires and fires in general spreading insanely, impacting air quality. Even though I live in the heart of the fucking country, I'm dealing with that. We just had a massive fire at a warehouse 2 days ago in Kansas City that was billowing black smoke, a column of it just straight up into the air for hours. And it brought our air quality to it was very dangerous for people who have sensitive respiratory systems. They straight up were recommended to not be outside at all. Honestly, everyone was recommended not to be outside. It was just below the point of dangerous for everyone. Even healthy people would not be able to breathe this air okay. It was very bad. The next day it was slightly better and it seems to be all right. I don't think there's been any confirmation of what was in this warehouse, but it was black smoke for hours. We are going to still see things like that in the Midwest. It doesn't matter that we won't be swallowed by the ocean. We will still be touched, very much so, by climate change. Truthfully, the people who will remain least affected are the rich, the people who are able to secure power during these extreme situations via solar panels or off the grid systems where they have their own batteries or whatever generators. It'll be the people who can reinforce their houses to where they are less affected by the strengthening storms. It'll be as it's always been, it'll be the wealthiest of people in areas that are least affected, while the rest of the people are disproportionately affected.
Churning as it reaches a boiling point. It's more like there's a kind of chronic, generalized instability in certain places that over time leads people to fly off in all different directions. So there's both a really distinct similarity, and that's like the racial and class divisions. And then there's a dissimilarity, which is like it's just not by any means so coordinated or recognizably directional as the Great Migration was.
Have you considered what Ben Shapiro posed years ago, that people who are...
I think she's gonna say... I almost brought this up too. I'm pretty sure she's gonna bring up that dumbass Ben Shapiro quote where he's like, do you not think that if people's homes were being swallowed by the water due to climate change, that they would not just sell their homes and move? And it was to completely speed over and disregard the fact that if a home is at danger, or even worse, right now being swallowed by the ocean, if it is actively being destroyed, the value is plummeting. How will they sell the home and have enough money to move? Because they'll likely be upside down on the loan. And before we even figure out that part, who are they selling the home to? Who is going to buy the house that is being swallowed by the ocean and destroyed by climate change? Who? Like, what? You can't even sell that to a real estate developer because they will recognize it as a horrible investment. I don't want to build condos here. I don't want to be a slumlord here. I would have them complaining about everything all the time. I don't even like when they do that now under normal circumstances. Like, literally no one's going to buy it. But Ben doesn't care. He's not here for solutions. Ben is not here to let people think. He is not here to provide solutions. He is here to incite culture wars. He is here to provide answers. And he is here to spew rhetoric that reaffirms his beliefs. He's not helping. He's just helping his team, which is different. Just helping your team for the sake of helping your team is a much different thing than trying to actively improve the world around you with a critical lens. But, that's a nuance lost on him and most.
Experiencing flooding should just sell their homes, and then that kind of solves everything.
It's a very funny video that I watched several times while writing the book, and it's very interesting because there's an element of that that's actually currently baked into the actual functioning of the housing market in coastal places, right? Which is like when people do buy a home in a risky area, they sort of have the assumption that they are going to be able to sell it to someone else,
Right.
not Aquaman, as the video says, but you know, somebody else will go. And in part,
Fucking Aquaman.
There's just not enough information in the market about what the potential risks are, and we don't exactly know what the timeline is. So sea level rise, it's very difficult to predict. So when I start a 30-year mortgage in, you know, Miami, I don't really know how many 30-year mortgages there are left before the home is underwater. So yeah, I mean, there's a kind of like, I think I wanted to liken in the book to like when Wile E. Coyote like runs off the cliff and he doesn't notice that he's running on air until he looks down.
Yeah.
But then as soon as he looks down, he starts falling. So like that, you know, Ben Shapiro's mistake is actually kind of like really, really insightful in a reverse way, because it's actually the way that the market works right now. And at some point that will change.
Yeah, I mean, you particularly focus
Also,
on it, I would say.
That's a good point. Him bringing up that's the way the market works, that's bullshit. You know, this idea that like, oh, if my home becomes unlivable for me, if it becomes what I would consider to be problematic and something I will not put up with and I must move away, well then I'll just find some poor unfortunate fuck to sell it to. That's insane. Like, I'm dealing with some things with this house. I don't know how old it was, but one thing I keep learning as I'm like going through trying to fix stuff is like, this must have been like the last goddamn house that they were building in this neighborhood. They were over it, dude. The hinges, like the screws they use for the hinges or the pins they use for the hinges, they're not long enough. They don't go all the way through the hinge. Take that concept and apply it to this entire fucking house. Nothing was done the way it should have been done. Most things were done in a way that's like, good enough. It's terrible. And I was looking at the value of my house the other day. It's actually gone up quite a bit since I purchased it, which makes me feel a type of way. It makes me happy because I do plan to sell this house and move at some point. This is just like, you know, I didn't even plan to buy this house. We just got kind of stuck with it because of circumstance. It's a whole thing. We basically had to buy it or get out in a couple weeks, and we didn't have the money to do that, so we had to commit. Which, you know, another reason why our current system is broken. There are things I want to do to improve it. Like I want to rewire the entire house when we move out, so it's nicer for the next person, because we've been dealing with a lot of problems as a result. Not a lot of people want to do shit like that. And also I have to like wrestle with this idea of understanding and knowing that the housing market is inflated so badly right now, and it's so bad that so many people are facing situations where they feel like they will never, and likely will never, be able to purchase a home. I have to decide how I can right that wrong. Sell this house, still make ideally some money on it, but not just be exploiting the fuck out of some person and furthering the housing market problems. And I feel like the best way I can do that is to like actually improve the house with, you know, the means I'm able to. I don't know. I don't know what the right way to do it is, but our housing system, our real estate system, it's totally fucked. I've always hated that idea of like, when a house is falling apart, you just find someone to sell it to who is okay. So you find someone to sell it to who can afford this cheap house, right? But the chances of that person being able to actually take care of the house, or not necessarily take care of is one thing, but improve it, you know, future-proof it, rewire it, get new windows, get a new roof. It's even less. And that's intentional, but it's sad. I don't know. It's just like, it seems so fundamentally broken, to me, but you know, rich people like to build their own houses. They don't like to remodel houses. And everyone always says that's easier. Everyone always says it's easier to start from scratch and build a new house than it is to like pay to redo stuff. I don't know if that's true. Maybe it is because of the additional labor time of like taking down stuff, but what are we gonna do when we just have a bunch of abandoned houses? I guess we'll just end up like California. Like, what are we gonna do when we have a bunch of abandoned houses everywhere and people who can't afford them, you know? Or like a bunch of abandoned houses that we consider unlivable. Like, What is that? Just like what real estate developers wait for? They wait for a bunch of houses to depreciate in value so much from, you know, being redlined in a way to where it's like a low income area, and then they wait until the value of the property is so low and the quality of the homes are so low that it becomes very cheap to knock it all down and stand up their condos. That's probably what it is. Oh God.
Or maybe the one of the more relevant parts to this particular talking point is your Santa Rosa example, where there was this massive housing shortage after wildfires. It's different than flooding, but it is an example of housing being at the forefront of this. And like, my aunt lives in Santa Rosa. I have heard a lot about what that experience has been like.
Yeah, my uncle's had to evacuate once or twice from his area in California.
Through my family, like what facing those wildfires and how that created such insecurity there.
Dude,
of course,
my uncle not only has had to evacuate from his house once or twice because of wildfires in Northern California, where they're actually less common, I believe. But he also got in trouble with his fucking landlord because he had some friends that were devastated by the fires. They lost fucking everything. They had nowhere to go and they were trying to figure this shit out. So he was like, you can just stay with me for a while, all right? I'm not in the area of this one, so you could come stay at my place. We'll figure it out. It'll be fine. He got in trouble for letting people stay with him during the wildfires. His fucking dick shit landlord was like, oh, you can't be having people in this house without, you know, them being on the lease or whatever the fuck. Like, he couldn't be human enough for 5 seconds to be like, oh, they lost everything to the fire. That's definitely an extenuating circumstance. I can definitely understand you wanting to help out your friend. Hell, I'd probably want to help out my friend. If I had an empty unit, might even let them stay there for a while. But no, this is not a sympathy or empathy they will extend to people outside of their own social circle, and especially to their tenants. We are supposed to be unemotional robots who only abide by contracts in their eyes. And I just remember being so upset about that. Just like, it's like akin to the fucking Joel Osteen not letting people in his house or his giant mega church during the earthquake because he didn't want them to get their pour on it or whatever the fuck before he filmed. Like, it's insane to be that inhumane in the face of like a horrific natural disaster. Especially as like an American, and this is weird to say because normally I'm not like super patriotic like this, but America kind of makes it its whole bag to be the world police and, you know, deployer of the Red Cross or whatever for humanitarian relief in some circumstances, and others not so much. But it's kind of like part of our identity, our global identity, to be pretty humanitarian in response to natural disasters. But we are very picky and choosy, both globally and at home, with which ones we really support. And that's obviously been called out with, like, you know, the response time to Katrina. But, like, I don't know if any of you guys have read the book Zaytoon. Okay. Is that it? Zaytoon book. I might be spelling it wrong. Yeah, Zaytoon. This book is about a man. It's a book that was written by his wife. Yeah. Abdulrahman and Kathleen Zaytoon he went by Zaytoon for the most part, run a house painting business in New Orleans in August 2005. As Hurricane Katrina approaches, Kathy evacuates with her 4 young children, leaving Zaytoon. They had like a van of some kind. I remember they were always talking about the van. But she takes the 4 children in the van and they leave. Zaytoon decides to watch over the house and the business because they honestly can't really afford much otherwise. And normally in the past, storms have been overblown. So he falsely thinks, like, you know, maybe it won't be as bad as they're saying. I'm going to stay. I'm going to make sure everything's okay. It gets really, really bad. In the days following the storm, he travels the city by canoe, feeding abandoned animals and helping elderly neighbors. Then on September 6th, police officers armed with M16s arrest Zaytoon in his home. Told with eloquence and compassion, Zaytoon is a riveting account of one family's unthinkable struggle with forces beyond wind and water. Wow, okay, that does it no justice. He was falsely detained as a suspected terrorist because our government thought there was a possible terrorist attack happening within Hurricane Katrina. I believe at one point they may have even been entertaining the idea that Hurricane Katrina was a terrorist attack itself. He was held, he was starved, he was tortured for months. He was not returned to his family for months, possibly even over a year. I can't remember. It's been since high school that I read this. He was only fed meat, or mostly only fed during times of fasting for his own religion, or fed meat specifically times when he was not supposed to consume it, or on holidays he was not allowed to consume it. Him and other Middle Easterners were tortured with fucking fire extinguishers and dogs. Dogs terrify a lot of Middle Eastern people because culturally they are not common there. They are seen as wild animals, unpredictable, and wolves. They would keep these men on buckets, standing on buckets, blindfolded, and have dogs just out of range barking at them to keep them terrified. And they were already starving and in cages and being beaten regularly. Our government did disgusting things to Middle and Easterners in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, and that's where our focus was. It was not on the humanitarian effort of relieving the situation, of helping out actual civilians. It was about gathering Middle Eastern people in a flooded city to hold them illegally. Like, oh, it's crazy, dude. And it's something I don't feel like a lot of people know about. And I remember reading it and my heart was just fucking breaking. And also I was just so furious about how dumb our intelligence people were. As a child in high school, like I thought this was like, what information could they have possibly have to justify this? And the truth is, it wouldn't really matter. They just don't care. It's just about seeing them as a second-class citizen. It's just about seeing them as disposable or, you know, possible villains and nothing else. That's the sad truth of it. It's taken me a long time to realize there are people in this world that genuinely just don't care. And I still struggle with how I feel is best and healthiest for me to respond to that, both in terms of improving the world around me and maintaining my own peace. It's tough, but yeah, Zaytoon is a heartbreaking book to read if you ever read it. He lost like half his body weight, maybe about. Ridiculous. He lost so much weight by the time his wife finally got him. For the longest time, she was stonewalled. It's a fascinating book. It's a heartbreaking book. I think it's an important book that people should be aware of, because that's modern American history. That's us blaming a people for a tragedy they had nothing to do with. And especially in the context of climate change, more disasters coming, it's a concerning piece of our recent history, and indicative possibly of more abuse towards people and groups of people as we move forward through more and more severe tragedies.
For people on the front lines, it's devastating. Talk a bit about that chapter in your book. How wildfires affected the housing market there.
Right. Yeah, I think this is like a really important example, because there was a really dire existing problem in that area before the wildfire, which is that there's just this extreme shortage of housing. It had one of the lowest vacancy rates in the country, and we can go into all the reasons why that's true in Northern California and California generally. But that wasn't caused by climate change, obviously. But then you have a city where there's already really no vacant rental housing, and then suddenly 4,000 or 5,000 homes get wiped off the map, and those are, you know, not only apartments but also relatively large homes that were owned by relatively wealthy people. And so it took this existing problem and made it like, it sort of supercharged it, right? Where you have these wealthy people who lost their homes and they're looking for a place to go. So maybe they have a second home and they suddenly say, okay, well, we're gonna, you know, kick our renter out of our second home and live there, or we're going to go to our vacation home.
Oh shit, I didn't even think about that. Yeah, they can do that. They can just, I don't know that they can terminate the lease, but they can certainly not renew it. That's crazy. I didn't think about that. Fuck. Dude, that's just, oh my god. That's just another way landlords are about to make tenant life hell. We need more tenant unions. Crazy.
and there's this downward pressure that happened where renters and people who had the least equity in their homes already, they ended up basically getting pushed out of the market because there was no longer space for people at the top. And so everyone got crowded down. And so I spoke to several people who, they rented one apartment for every 6 months for years, and they paid, 3 times what they'd paid before the fire. I spoke to people who just gave up on California. They ended up moving to places like Kentucky where they had family. So yeah, it's just like created this sort of insane chaos for years, and the prices have never really stabilized because it takes so long to rebuild that supply. And in the meantime, more people show up, sort of undeterred by the fire. And so it's just like it's a mess, right?
Yeah, dude, the fire deterred the fuck out of me. I used to want to live near LA, obviously Southern California, like everyone else in the Midwest, just dying to get the fuck out of here. I wanted it so bad. And then I learned about the fires. I learned about the fire tornadoes, and I was out. I couldn't do that. Also, clearly, there's too many people there, or a very high concentration of, well, I guess not necessarily, because it's more of a global effect. Regardless, I very quickly started to reconsider. At that point, I was looking at Washington, stuff like that, Oregon, west, but in the rain. There are still fires there.
The sense I was trying to capture in that chapter of just like those first few months and that first year after the fire, people were paying, 10 grand a month just to get a place to live. And it was just this like chaos and trauma of living through that market, almost more traumatic than the experience of fleeing the fire itself for many people.
The shock of having to essentially run through your savings just in a second to get housing after a climate disaster.
That's insane.
I mean, these states like California, New York, that have kind of blue legislatures need to get to the forefront of creating some sort of fund for people to not make
either fund, or they need to come up with regulations on how much can be charged for certain properties. Like the government needs to assess the value of properties and determine, okay, homie, for the next 5 years, you cannot charge more than this for this property, barring a situation that calls for a reassessment. Obviously, if there's some major change, maybe the government, it would obviously require the standing up of a new department, but hell, that might be what we need. It would provide jobs for people, a transition into that, which is good because people are always worried about automation causing jobs. But here's a new market where you just assess properties, how much they're worth, and determine how much can legally be charged for them over the next 5 years, a max amount. Unfortunately, I think that would lead to a lot of people saying, okay, I'm going to charge the max every time. Which is fine, but at least we have a limitation. We don't have people rising it to 10 grand for a month. That's insane. That's $120,000 a year for an apartment. What? Oh my God, dude. Oh my God. Yeah, it's definitely not gonna be California. I'll tell you that much right now. It'll never be California for me if that's common.
Maybe not even relocate them, but get some subsidy for finding housing during that period, because like you speak about as well in the book, the rising insurance premiums in a lot of these areas of the country. I mean, this is just going to become a huge problem as more climate displacement happens. Insurance not being able, people being priced out of insuring their homes in this way.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that dynamic?
Yeah, this has also been an issue in California and Florida, especially, where basically the insurance companies, they have difficulty, they're answerable to shareholders, so they have to turn a profit, and they kind of can't turn a profit, or they say they can't, at least in California and Florida, because the amount they have to pay out in damages and claims and what's called reinsurance is more than they take in from the premiums, right? So basically they say, well,
that's a byproduct of a broken system that's destroying the environment. So maybe you should stop lobbying against regulations that would help improve that situation, and you will find that you are less financially burdened. When you lobby for things that ultimately are not in your best interest, you are more than likely going to face those consequences at some point. I really don't feel bad for these people. Also, obviously their focused in primary goal will always be turning a profit for their shareholders and investors, as long as we live in a capitalistic society, which demands that the focus be on capital, because it's where power is seated, it's where influence spreads from, it is what keeps the economy and the system running around, so to speak, or at least that's how everything's built to function. It's all based off the movement of money. It's why everyone always says follow the money here, because that's where you find the real motive. In a socialist society or a democratic socialist society, the priorities are society and the quality of life of society, the social aspects of it, the people, or in the democratic social situation, the majority voice, and quality of life for people, and ensuring the highest quality of life and voices are highest majority of voices are heard in any given situation. That's really the main difference on a base level. It's insane to me that we've been able as a nation to sell this idea otherwise for so long, that like capitalism good, socialism bad. Especially because like we're social creatures, we're altruistic by nature, we rely on each other. Monkeys, even most primates, exist in family groups because it allows more than one person to help raise their young. It allows more than one person to help protect the young, keep an eye out for predators, to protect the young, to gather food for the old, the sick, the young, and make sure everyone is taken care of. It's why there's like that's just how we work. It's just our lizard brain, man. It's just how we function. And the idea that we've sold this lie that is the exact opposite of who we are, and that capitalism is possibly closer to human nature, the whole hunter-gatherer, I get mine before you get yours, we all die, or like I'll watch you die as I eat, thinking like if only you were a better hunter, which is crap. It's such crap. I don't like how and why would we have domesticated animals if that was true? Why wouldn't we have just let the dogs die, let the wolves die? Why did we invite them in? Probably because we found that they would help with hunting. They might have even like been more acclimated towards us because they hunted with us, but like we gave them food, they became friends. We didn't have to give them food. We could have just watched them die, right? I get mine before you get yours. But no, there was a value there, a partnership, a social relationship that greatly benefited both sides. And the same logic can be applied to, every other human. But we have a lot of people who understand the world as the opposite of that. They think we are not social creatures. But if that was true, the worst thing we could do to a person wouldn't be putting them in solitary confinement. The worst thing we could do to them wouldn't be denying them sunlight and people. It just wouldn't. But it is, because we're social.
Well, if we can't raise prices to really, really high levels, we're just going to kind of have to get out of certain areas, these like mountainous areas of California, for instance, where it's just like too risky, they say, to insure. And so the state, like California legislature and the insurance office there, they've tried really hard to tamp down this sort of like runaway problem in the insurance market. But it's really, really difficult to find out a way to bring the companies to heel without driving them out of the state altogether, right? Because they could also say, we don't want to write here, period, right? Let alone just like in those specific areas. But I think like in general, in all the places where this happens,
that's another problem with giving corporations and lobbyists too much power, is they can start holding communities hostage like that. It's like that thing in Parks and Rec where Sweetums threatens to pull out of the town if their son doesn't win the councilman election. Obviously, that's a blatant abuse of power that I'm pretty sure would fly even America today. But you have situations where there is a vague threat to devastate a community or a state or city's economy if you don't play ball, so to speak, with your financial overlords. For my hometown, it's the Koch brothers. The Koch brothers are from Wichita, Kansas, and they dominate the fuck out of it. They recently, well, not super recently, but they within the last 5-10 years, bought a bunch of land that was the WSU, Wichita State University, golf course. It was kind of historical. It was a beloved thing in the city. Golf courses are a blight environmentally, so there is that, but they didn't really improve that situation. They tore down the entire golf course and stood up a business section or a business campus for WSU. They fund this business campus, and they're the majority supporters financially of it. They also have somewhat of a say on what professors will be teaching on this business campus. Now you see where things get weird, because you have someone with very specific, what most would consider radical political beliefs, hand picking or having a pretty strong say in what in how business will be framed to the incoming generation of students. It's not good, but it's sadly expected behavior. A little before that, Coke also paid. They wanted the city to move a road that was right outside their main office building, because protesters would regularly gather outside the main office building and protest Koch brothers, the Koch brothers for being just the worst human beings, or some of the worst human beings in the country. Well, they didn't like that. So they wanted to move the road and build a new campus parking lot around their building that involved having a big hill, a little mound at the end of the parking lot. That way, if there were any protesters that were gathering legally, they just wouldn't be in view. You couldn't see them at all from the building or even from the parking lot. They're on the other side of the hill, but they couldn't step onto the hill. And furthermore, they planted trees all along that hill to create like a visibility thing. That's what they wanted. The city said, we can't afford to move a road. Also, we have like this whole grid thing going, and you just want to take one road and make it a curve. And we're not big on that. And then the Koch brothers said, well, what if we pay for it? What if we pay for all of the construction? We just, get the approval to do it. And the city said, well, our roads are shit, so yeah, go ahead. And they did it. So now their protesters they bother them a lot less there. And that was the entire reason behind that. They dominate my hometown. They do whatever the fuck they want, and it's disgusting. But you see that happen everywhere under capitalism, because what can you do when capital holds power and this company in town has some of the most capital in the entire nation? You really don't have much you can do as one small municipal entity.
Different perils, fire, hurricanes, windstorm damage. What you kind of see is that there's it really, really raises the threshold for who can afford home ownership, as opposed to renting, right?
Yes,
so
which is already insanely high given the quality of life for the generation that is.
Yeah, exactly. Like I think people who are my age will say, well, I couldn't afford a house anyway before climate change. But like there's this serious thing where like we think in the United States of like the middle class, upwardly mobile homeowner as somebody who saves up and they put equity in a home. It's an investment, and they're supposed to be able to keep up with it and then use that to like ascend the income ladder. Right. And that, because of housing supply shortages, and then because of insurance especially, it's kind of become like an illusion for a lot of people in the riskiest areas, right? Where the cost of insurance is just so much that it's impossible to keep up with most mortgages, even in relatively affordable areas.
That
makes
like sense.
A serious spiritual problem for the country, as well as a policy problem, where it's like this sort of much touted class of people, the middle class, it's sort of being eroded by the cost.
It's funny that he says sort of, because the middle class has been draining and disappearing and fading away since Reagan. And at this point, it's just like, I don't know. Some would argue there is no middle class anymore.
Of climate change.
Yeah. Juniper J, one of our IMers, writes in and said, also consider that in Florida, homeowners cannot get home insurance. DeSantis called for a special session to address this, but passed fascist legislation instead.
Cool.
I wasn't aware of that homeowner insurance element. Is that something you're up on?
Yeah, so years ago, like about 3 decades ago, after a hurricane in 1990.
By the way, the culture wars that we see in our country, like, you know, against like transgenderism or like wokeness or Pride Month, all of those just mostly serve as talking points from, like I said, the people who don't give a shit and don't have any morals. Anyway, they're trying to whip up frenzies that keep us arguing about this stuff, which matters, sure, but not as much as the other stuff like school shootings, gun control, gun reform, and the housing crisis. You know, if we can keep arguing about this stuff, we're not actively talking about how these situations are quickly accelerating to points of we cannot maintain this long. This will not go well. Between climate change, that needs to be mitigated soon. The housing crisis, and homelessness crisis, that's gonna hit a fan at some point. It's going, like, these are not sustainable numbers. We've seen lots of countries go through this. America's a young new country. It has not had its giant people's revolt where there's a fundamental change in the power structure and economic structure of the country. Most countries go through that at some point. We've never done that. We've done a few revolutions here and there, a few big changes or movements here and there, but we have not had the people's revolt, so to speak. And it really doesn't even matter as much as I wish it did, because even looking at other countries where they've done these things, you know, Europe, England, the UK, all over the world, we still can basically summarize most of the world in terms of like what do they call them, tier 1 nations or whatever the fuck, I don't know, like the UK, China, whatever. Most of those can be summarized as an elite rich few exploiting and benefiting off of the labor and backs of the working class of that country. Things change, you know. What we have now is called corporate feudalism. It's the same thing as the Middle Ages, where you were a slave but only based off of debt. If you owed a great debt to someone, you worked for them forever, indefinitely, until you paid off that debt, and it never really was paid off. And so you and your family were indentured servants. We have the same thing now, but they learned that if they don't give us enough options, that we will revolt faster and call it out quicker. So now we get to choose the field we work in. We get to choose what we go into massive amounts of debt to learn in school and start participating in the system. But once we have that massive amount of debt, we have put the shackles on ourselves. I now must work. I now must perpetuate this system, because if I am not generating income, I will not be able to pay my debt and I will fall out of society. They just learned how to shift some things around, rename some things, and structure things in a slightly less oppressive way to create corporate feudalism. And here we are in it. It is still a form of indentured servitude. It is still debt-based servitude. And there is still little to virtually zero chance of anyone in that working class, in that feudalistic class, ascending to the point of, you know, no longer being exploited, but now exploiting. And also it raises the question, do you even want to? Like, would that even really be better? Or would it just be better for you personally and worse for you, like, spiritually? Because that's, I don't know. I mean, that's some serious class trading.
To the insurance market basically in Florida basically collapsed, and it was like, I mean, this is like a controversial way to put it. It was basically partially socialized. Like, there's a public option for insurance, for windstorm insurance in Florida, and there's all these small private companies that still offer, but they have sort of started to flee in recent years as the cost of hurricanes has gone up. And like Juniper's right, there's a lot of people who can't get insurance except for through this public option, which is really expensive, is not very good coverage, and everybody's going to it. So it's like this enormous burden on like the public purse. And I think the big question for the like very conservative Florida legislature is how do you manage this system where basically the taxpayers are now footing the bill for, there's basically a public subsidy for insurance in risky places. And can they like turn it back into a normal market, a functioning sort of the free market that a conservative want? I kind of think the answer is no. But in either case, right, like it's like you're basically transferring the risk of people who live in really, really risky areas, not often through fault of their own, but you're transferring that to everybody, even people who don't own homes, right? So basically,
it's almost never through the fault of their own. Zip codes determine so much about a person's life in America. And if you look at the civil rights movement, if you look at where in the 1950s they decided to make highways and cut through poor income neighborhoods, if you look at our nation and when things were set up, a lot of these decisions were intentional, and a lot of these cultures are perpetuated now. It is not like okay, so towards the end of my childhood, my mom was she made it to suburbia. It was a long journey, but she finally made it to suburbia, and it was great. But I quickly noticed in suburbia something that was not as common for me in my mom's neighborhoods, which was the neighborhood seemed weirdly segregated. There was this street, and if you crossed the street, it stopped being homes and started being duplexes. And a lot of the people of color lived past that street in the duplexes. There were like one or two families, obviously, that lived in the houses with, the other half of the neighborhood. But I noticed this, and I remember thinking, that's really weird. Why? That seemed like, because I used to walk around the neighborhood all the time, and I remember when I really started to notice it, I was like, this is creepy. Like this is like 1950s America creepy. And then I would go on to learn, it's a system that's basically more or less been in place since the 1950s. It's the idea of, barring people out of education, so they are less likely to get jobs that pay better, barring people financially, so they are less likely to get the loans that they need to purchase homes or purchase, nicer homes, quote unquote, in certain areas of the city. It's about, barring them from voting to change these things or change them too aggressively. It's about creating a situation where statistically, if you are in a group of people, you are more or less likely to be successful. That's all it is. That's all it's ever been. And it's why some people have to climb 4 times higher on the ladder as some other people to get as far. It's because the country was built in a way to make sure, oh, you're one of them? Well, let me make your ladder taller. And it's so gross and heartbreaking, dude. It's disgusting. And I remember when I realized that, I don't know. I just remember thinking, I thought we all agreed this was wrong. Like, even in my conservative, strict, very religious Catholic school, the tone, or at least the words that were being shared when we were talking about this stuff, civil rights, was we were wrong for doing this. We were wrong for persecuting these people. We were wrong for, disenfranchising them intentionally. But then I grew up to learn we were wrong for getting caught was actually what the tone more or less is. Like, yes, obviously, some of my teachers probably actually believed that we were wrong. Yes, whatever. But the book, I mean, like, and the book also had somewhat of that tone of like, we were wrong. But then where's the action? Where's the actions that back up those words? If we truly feel this way and we're teaching our children that, these things are wrong, then how come so many of our systems still perpetuate the same outcome? It's another reskinning of feudalism. It's the same thing. We took slavery and recoded it. We had Jim Crow era for a long time, and that didn't work. So we had the civil rights movement. Well, then what did we do at the civil rights movement? If you look at incarceration rates, let's look at it. Incarceration rates. So if we look at incarceration rates for the U.S., it all becomes very clear. The 13th Amendment is, you know, the amendment that outlaws slavery, except for punishment of a crime. When slave labor is used as punishment for a crime, it's totally legal in the United States. Prisoners provide free labor for the state. A lot of us are familiar with this concept in terms of them picking up litter on the side of the road or making license plates like they show in cartoons or old cartoons a lot. Truthfully, a lot of the work is related to military, the military industrial complex, and sometimes even the putting out of wildfires. You know, we saw a lot of inmates being used to on the front lines of wildfires in California and dying ultimately as they were given the opportunity to make their lives a little better, I'm sure, in some way, either lessening their sentence time total or paying them a little. I know they were only making 10 cents an hour to fight those fires, though. Maybe that's better than the other jobs they could get, but it's still horrendous. But if we look, it was the 60s and 70s when we had the civil rights movement, right? When we stopped just changing things on paper. And we really stopped not giving people of color, you know, adequate wages, not letting them work anywhere, not letting them buy houses. And as soon as we did that, we had to come out with another way, or white supremacists had to come up with another way to disenfranchise people of color. So what did they do? Well, the 13th Amendment made it okay in terms of a punishment for a crime. So we started disproportionately policing and arresting people of color and poorer people to ensure that they would still be providing free labor to the state. And if you look in 1980, the amount at which we're incarcerating people jumps drastically. People did not become more violent. People did not just decide to start committing more crimes out of nowhere. That's not even entertainable as a theory. This is a direct response to trying to improve the lives of people of color. It is a direct response to the state losing its cheap / free labor and an attempt to grab it back. Especially when it comes to things like the military industrial complex. This is what people mean when they say, you know, the 13th Amendment didn't end slavery. This is what people mean when they say that our current privatized prison system is quite possibly the center of white supremacy in, or furthering white supremacy in America. Because this is it. This is what we thought we squashed. This is what we were taught was wrong. It was ended with Lincoln, and then again in the civil rights era. This is it. It's always been here. And this is why I say I struggle to think that we'll ever get away from it. It is unfortunately and disgustingly tied to race here in America. But if you look all over the world, people are exploited for their labor for the few. That is the theme. That has been the theme of society for a really, really long time.
Like, you're taking a person who maybe owns a car in Orlando but rents an apartment, and their tax burden is in part the burden of like a person who owns a mansion in Miami Beach. So that's like a very, very difficult situation that I don't know that the legislature is quite equipped to address. They don't seem super interested in like a comprehensive solution.
It doesn't seem to be the case. But I guess let's talk a bit more about Florida, because that's your first chapter,
yes,
right?
That's where I'm from.
Oh,
yes.
there you go. Whereabouts?
Tampa, about an hour north of Tampa.
Tampa, there you go.
I'm gonna go get a drink.
So, you start in Florida, telling the story of a guy named Patrick Garvey. This was, I guess, one of the 3 chapters in the start of your book where you're focusing on these human stories behind the weather disasters. What's Patrick Garvey's story?
Yeah, he came from Canada down to Florida, sort of just like looking for meaning, and he spent about 5 years rehabilitating this tropical fruit grove that had kind of gone to seed It was the property of this old hermit, and it became like this public sort of community resource on this island called Big Pine Key, which was like one of the last kind of like working class enclaves in the Florida Keys archipelago. And then this hurricane called Irma, just an astonishingly powerful hurricane. Just all but, you know, he had basically
I think I remember her. Well, maybe I don't remember Hurricane Irma. Yeah, I do remember Hurricane Irma. I remember talking about this. Well, not like with people, not, you know, not content wise. 2017, I was nowhere near making this kind of content.
Spent almost a decade restoring this grove, and right as he finished, basically the hurricane destroyed it. Also kind of destroyed his life. His marriage fell apart. His kids went with their mother to Brazil, and he basically spent like 5 years kind of in like a dark night of the soul trying to restore this grove, only to kind of find that long term there's this other vulnerability that the island faces from sea level rise. So as the seas get higher, even independent of a storm, water will creep underneath, salt water will creep underneath the island, potentially making it very difficult to grow tropical fruit.
Shit, that makes sense. Oh my god. I don't know how you would combat that, especially because I'm pretty sure salt water, that'll probably kill a plant. That'll probably kill a plant so fast. Oh man. Maybe there are other crops you can plant to try and like rewrite the levels of, you know, phosphate, nitrogen, whatever, or phosphorus, nitrogen, whatever, in your soil, but will those crops even be able to grow under the conditions? Ooh, that's tough.
So I was kind of using it to show that there's like these two scales of vulnerability that people face in climate change, and the Keys is like a great example, where on the one hand you have these giant kind of percussive disasters that completely destroy housing stock and render people without their homes, and then you have these slower moving disasters like sea level rise or drought, where people's sort of their ability to engage with the land and their ability to work, their ability to live sort of erodes over time. And the worst affected places are dealing with both of those at the same time. And in the case of the Keys, like the risk is really existential from both, that you might not really be able to, the place might not really be able to survive on a century-long time scale because there's just so much risk.
That's insane to think about, but I mean, obviously, it makes total sense. Another place that you highlight that has is in a very vulnerable position is this indigenous community in Louisiana. Obviously, Louisiana vulnerable and
yeah, Louisiana vulnerable for sure on its own, and indigenous people are for certain some of the least looked after and protected people in the United States historically, especially. Yeah. I don't I don't think there is a quite better example of America's like not only past failures and mistakes, but current failure to make things right or acknowledge even what we've done wrong. It's another thing where I was taught growing up, you know, how wrong it was of us to displace Native Americans the way we did, and the awful things we did to them, the way we, you know, gave them smallpox blankets and stuff. I was taught these things, and I was taught these things with the tone and, you know, idea that we should move away from this, and this is not okay, and pushing them onto reservations was bad. But then I only grew up to find out that no one actually gives a shit, and no one's reversing any of that stuff. And everyone's all too eager to say, oh, well, fucking me. It's old America. Don't get mad about it. As if we're not actively choosing to not correct and make the situation right, or at least closer to, every single day. It's crazy. It's crazy. As if we're not recently having a court case go up to the Supreme Court where, you know, a white family was saying, you know, the bill or act that prioritizes indigenous families to be the receiver of indigenous children when they are taken into our system. You know, like if an indigenous child is going up for adoption, priority goes to indigenous people to not rip this child away from their culture. A white family recently pushed a case up to the Supreme Court saying that was discriminatory because it doesn't let white people adopt the child, and therefore unconstitutional. because it specifically discriminates based off of race. Thank God the court case came back as, you know, they said the law it does not violate the Constitution. It is not constitutional. And so therefore they didn't really comment on whether or not it was discriminatory in nature. But that is indicative of our mentality and understanding of the communities we have devastated, and damaged beyond repair. Full repair for certain.
A variety of different ways. We know this from Katrina and more. Talk a bit about that if you don't mind, Jake.
Yeah, so this is I was trying to kind of look at the effects of sea level rise and coastal erosion on, you know, coastal communities that aren't like big developed cities like Miami. So I went to this area about an hour and a half south of New Orleans. This is a long, very, very long standing indigenous community, mostly made up of like inshore shrimp fishermen. And for a long time, it was extremely self-sufficient. Like they could raise cattle, they could grow their own crops, they could obviously get shrimp and get pelts from nutria to sell for fur. And then as the coast eroded, it just became impossible to sustain this kind of community, right? Like the ground was too wet for the cattle to walk on. It's too salty to grow the crops. And the independence of the community kind of fell apart. And the only available work, besides offshore shrimp fishermen, is working for the oil industry. And there's a kind of
which
like
is only serving to further the problem
here that I thought was really important to highlight, where, you know, there's both man-made climate change, which is like these global phenomena that are changing the way that weather works and water works, and that's happening there. But there's also this just sort of like straightforward human-caused environmental degradation that you can see right in front of your eyes. And so in the case of Louisiana, it was the oil industry that they basically sliced up the whole marshland so that they could build canals to get, you know, benzene and oil in and out of the Gulf. And this was like there was a twofold problem where the oil industry, they destroyed the marsh, and then the global warming caused by the oil industry then further
dried
caused the
marsh.
seas to rise. So it's just sort of this nexus of a lot of
not dried the marsh. Anything drowned the marsh.
You know, a lot of the causes of climate change and just the way that we relate to land. And you had a community that had a deeply productive and sustainable relationship to this marshland environment that's basically been evicted over a century, you know, by the actions of big oil.
Well, it really is, you know, big oil creeping in. It's almost kind of shock doctrine on a micro scale where they're able to exploit the macro conditions created by climate change, which they contribute to. And then on the ground, they creep in on like indigenous self-sustaining communities for their own profit. That's a really good encapsulation of what we're dealing with, I would say. I also wanted to talk a bit about this North Carolina historically black city that was built on flood-prone land that you talk about in your book.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, the fact that city was even built also is one of the long-term kind of structural climate exposure issues for non-white, non-wealthy communities in the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, the town Lincoln City was built on land that I mean, essentially nobody else really wanted it, right? And this is true in a lot of other places in North Carolina, like where formerly enslaved populations they bought land that was too flood prone to use for agriculture, or that was how the white planters viewed it, right? And so this was a really like important one though, because a lot of times when you talk about the solutions to this kind of climate vulnerability, what people say is like, well, we can, you know, give people money to move elsewhere or relocate them. And that's like one of the best tools that we have to fix this problem, right? If you get people out of the way, then they can't be hit by the hurricane anymore, right? And so that makes sense in theory, but this was like the first time that the US government really tried this was in 2000 after these two hurricanes hit this black community. And basically they came in and said, well, we'll give you guys money if you leave and move somewhere else in the city. And, you know, there was really no other option as the government saw it. But for the people in the community, they saw this as a really, really deeply traumatic event, right? Where they wanted to stay. They wanted to rebuild, and they were really attached to this land. It was the only place that most of their families had.
Yeah, how could they not be? Obviously, people get attached to land. We would know all about that, driving people off of it.
Ever been able to own property or had ever lived in the postbellum era. And the government really didn't give them much of a choice. They said, well, we'll give you the money and you leave, right? And so this is called managed retreat. It's like a climate adaptation policy. But here it was a really, really, really tragic event, and it destroyed this really thriving community, which was very vulnerable. And a lot of the people, once they left and took the money, they really didn't fare so well. You know, their homes went into foreclosure because they couldn't keep up with the more expensive mortgage, or they lost track of their, community that they had once had. Right?
Yeah, so I was gonna say, like, it also kind of abolishes a local culture, like just completely destroys it, which is fucking tragic.
Cautionary tale for how to solve the problem of, like, yes, you can move people, but there's a really, really, really deep intangible thing that people have with their communities and with the places that they live.
A sense of self within the community, a sense of purpose within the community. A lot of people pull a fair amount of their own self-esteem from how they understand they fit within their local community, or whatever their local community is. For a lot of us people here on Twitch, it's in Twitch chats and in Discord chats, but for some people, it very much relies on their local community, people they're seeing every day, talking to every day, working with every day. And if you rip them away from all that, how could they not have some sort of identity struggles? Like, what? You've stripped them of purpose, of place, and of, social group. And it's gonna cause any person to flounder a little.
Respect that and find a way to honor that, even as we try to help people move out of the worst affected areas.
Right. I mean, in terms of that kind of mitigation for displacement, what do you see as some of the more viable paths forward that included, as long as it's structured in a way that puts vulnerable communities in mind, doesn't reverberate some of the already systemic issues? What are some of the best solutions you think?
Yeah, right. So, I mean, there's basically two options, right? You can do that. You can pay people to leave and try to help them relocate through sort of like long-term stipends, maybe like relocation assistance. Maybe, like as is the case in a few places, they've tried this after the recession, where maybe places that are less vulnerable, like give people money to move there. I think Detroit tried it. Oklahoma City maybe tried it for non-climate reasons. And then there's a second option, which is like you try to make the place less vulnerable that people already are, right? So, all over the Gulf Coast, there's like homes that are elevated 12 or 13 feet off the ground. That tends to help with storm surge. There's all kinds of things you can do with what are called living shorelines, or like create, parks or berms along the water to like help with the risk of flooding. And then, like you can retrofit homes themselves. So after Hurricane Andrew in 1992, Florida mandated like a really, really strong home construction standard that makes homes pretty resilient to hurricanes. Okay. You can do the same thing with wildfire. So you really have to decide between like armoring, so-called, or sort of resilience, as it's often referred to.
Yeah, which is kind of what I was getting at earlier when I was saying the only people who are going to be least affected by this stuff are richer people, because unless the government is seriously subsidizing, the process of, which I doubt they ever would, but unless the government is seriously subsidizing the process of making houses stronger or able to withstand, the unique area problems to their areas, people can't even afford to like replace their windows, let alone fortify the entire structure.
Or relocation. And that's a really, really difficult choice for communities to make. And I think the answer oftentimes is like, it's a little bit of both, where there's some areas where it's just so expensive and just it's impossible to find a way to protect. So you have to help those people move. And then there's some places like, for example, like downtown Manhattan, for instance, where it's very, very, very valuable and it's worth almost an unlimited amount of money to pay to protect, right? So you could build berms around downtown Manhattan, or, the Army Corps of Engineers wants to create these storm gates that you could use to control flooding. So there's all kinds of things you can do. And the Biden administration has started to spend a relatively small, but historically, relative to history, relatively large amount of money on pursuing some of them. But we're still kind of like in kindergarten on it. Like, we don't really know what works, what doesn't. And I think like there's a certain amount of experimentation that has to be done with both resilience and managed retreat before we're going to know what are the, the best practices in this regard, because we've really never tried it very much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't really had to deal with unprecedented global, climate shifts this fast. Because yes, the globe does go through phases. It does, transition, it ebbs and flows. But with climate change, we have seen changes that normally take thousands of years, if not 1,000 years, in the last 100. It's happening much, 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 much faster than it's ever happened before. And that doesn't give biological life the greatest chance of adapting and surviving. Is this the main problem there? Gradual change is something that things can very much work with and, slowly become accustomed to or evolve to. Sudden changes make for, endangered or extinct events.
We're playing with fire, no pun intended, but obviously there's going to need to be a robust ramp up in the coming years, since we're not meeting any of our targets, and the effects are definitely being
getting
felt
worse
acutely right now.
Yeah.
Jake Biddle, staff writer at Grist,
and they're only going to get
the
worse.
Great Displacement, Climate Change, and the Next American Migration. We'll put a link to your book in the description.
Yeah, I might have to read that one. If you made it this far into the video, you should really like it and subscribe to the channel, because you made it to the end of the video. No one does that anymore. Also, follow me on Twitch so you can catch us live and, actually hang out and talk with us. That'd be great. And follow my Twitter, HalfPint Games, my Instagram, HalfPintTTV, to see some more behind the scenes updates and stuff. There's also a link to my Discord server in the description below if you want to join that, kind of participate more in the community. And thanks again for watching, everyone. Hope you have a great day.
Beam chop! If this were a real attack, you'd be dead.